Alrighty then. So my name is Cliff Barbier, like Mary said. I am a product security architect for Equifax. Today we're going to talk about pandemic planning from an information security and a business continuity perspective. This should be a normal part of the business continuity management process, but today we're going to treat it as a special case for no reason in particular. So I won't be going too much into like business or health and safety or financial aspects. Specific issues in those areas would be addressed during planning. I'm just talking about the overall planning process. So I've done a lot of security work over the years, from pen testing to vulnerability scanning to audits. But for this talk, my most relevant experience is the 4 years that I spent as an FDIC IT examination analyst. So my pandemic planning experience is in banking, which is a critical infrastructure component that is often called upon to operate during emergencies, disasters, and pandemics. So while you may not work in a bank, I'm sure you'll find some useful information about what the banks do, right? And not all this will apply if you're not in a critical infrastructure job. So standard disclaimers, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a biologist, I'm not any kind of ologist, not a medical professional of any kind. What I am is a risk professional. I'm an auditor and I have examined bank pandemic planning for the FDIC. So start out today, we want to start with definitions. These are words that were not very well known a month ago. And even now, we want to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page for the terminology that we're going to use, right? So simple background terms, right? Disease is some abnormal condition that's going to negatively affect some part of you, basically, right? Not due to an injury, just something that has happened to you, right? So endemic describes kind of the constant presence of a disease within an area. Other terms that you may hear when you're talking about pandemic planning: sporadic. That's something the disease that occurs infrequently or irregularly. Hyperendemic is a persistent high level of disease occurrence. An outbreak kind of carries the same definition of an epidemic, but it's often used for a very limited geographical area. A cluster is an aggregation of cases grouped in time or place. But what we really care about is the word epidemic, right? That's where we kind of start with. So that's an often sudden increase in diseases above the endemic level, right? So it typically occurs when an agent, in this case a virus, but any other agent, and a susceptible host are present in adequate numbers, and the agent can go from host to host, right? An epidemic may happen because there's an increase in the amount or the virulence of an agent. The recent introduction of the agent into a place where it has never been before. The stereotypical story of the people from Europe bringing smallpox over into the Native Americans, where they didn't have any defenses against that. In some type of enhanced mode of transmission, so it's moving in a different way so that more people are exposed. Things like that. So epidemics, by the way, presumes infectious agents, but there are non-infectious diseases such as diabetes and obesity that exist in epidemic proportions, specifically in the US. And I mentioned that, and I'll explain why in a second. Pandemic, which is what we're having here, is an epidemic that's spread over several different countries or continents, usually affecting a large group of people. The important thing to know is pandemic, epidemic, all those kinds of terms we just mentioned, for the most part, refer only to the disease spread, right? It does not refer to the virulence, right? Its ability to infect. Doesn't refer to transmission rate, the speed with which it moves through a population. Does not refer to duration, right? How long someone gets sick or how long the event has lasted, and it doesn't refer to mortality, the death rate. You can have a non-lethal pandemic, right? It's only about the area, or let me rephrase it, it is primarily about the area. So pandemics, these types of things, they're handled by epidemiologists, right? They do a few different things: disease surveillance, epidemiological studies, vaccine creation, and disease response, right? How do we deal with this specific pandemic, right? What are the things that happen here, right? Why are you able to go out, for example, right now and get takeout food? Because they've determined that it does not spread via food. Well, okay. Other pandemics might, and so such things might actually be forbidden. So this is a graph that has become very familiar. Back in 2014, when I started giving this talk, I pulled this out of a study actually given by one of the authors here, and then I checked when I was updating this, and he had a much better version. But basically, this is what we're talking about when we talk about pandemics, right? The dirty little secret is it's not about necessarily shortening the time, right? It's about reducing the numbers over a longer period of time, right? And that can seem counterintuitive, but that is what is necessary sometimes to have this thing last twice as long, 3 times as long as it would have otherwise, in order to reduce the death rate, because you don't over capacity your healthcare system. So now we know why we care nowadays, right? But when I started giving this talk back in 2014, the effects of a pandemic weren't as obvious. But let's just kind of go through them anyway. So the primary one that most of us are seeing is a personnel impact, right? Severe pandemics, you have absenteeism. Now that's a non-judgmental term just for the person's not there, right? And you want them to be. So attributed to illness, the need for care for ill family members, the risk of a fear of infection, you can have 40, 50%. Now that's for a pandemic where you don't have social distancing measures in place, right? Certain public health measures like stay-at-home orders, school closing, quarantining households, etc., increase that even more, right? Another impact is to availability, right? Again, this is something that has historically been difficult to explain to businesses, but now that we've got an object lesson in the impact to availability that pandemic can cause, right? We can talk about this with a few more examples, right? So the disaster or emergency response mechanisms and methods that you rely on may not be feasible, right? If you expect to be able to go to another site, right, bring all of your people together at some place away from the disaster, well, A, there is no place away from this particular event, but also B, that might, in the case of a pandemic, cause more problems, even if you think everyone's asymptomatic, right? So a lot of the kind of availability planning you need to do will be similar to wide area disaster planning, right? I live in Louisiana. We learned a lot about recovery from Katrina. Recovery of a broad area, right, took years, and in some cases is still ongoing now, 15 years later. So the Department of Homeland Security created an agency to do what is essentially a business impact analysis for the United States. So that agency is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Before this pandemic started, they already had a list of critical infrastructure ready for this kind of event. Right? When Louisiana issued their stay-at-home order, they deferred to CISA as to what industries would be shut down and which ones would be allowed to operate. These are the general areas that they have identified. You can go to cisa.gov and find a little more specifics. I collapsed a few of them. But this business impact like analysis that they've done means that they know you can't, for example, shut down chemical infrastructure when critical manufacturing infrastructure relies on it for the raw materials they use to make PPE for the healthcare industry, right? They've done all the interrelation analysis and come up with these lists. So even though you may not see the immediate reasoning for some of these lists being on there, look back 2 or 3 layers and you probably will find the reason why. So let's talk for a second about the effects of a pandemic, right? And as I mentioned, this has nothing to do with mortality. So even assuming no deaths, right? Diseases can cost lost revenue when customers don't buy, right? Lost productivity when employees can't work. Continuity problems when the primary and your backup employee cannot work, right? As I mentioned before, selling these effects to businesses was harder 10 years ago than it will be going forward. But remember, this pandemic will not be how all pandemics will play out. Some future pandemics may not require stay-at-home orders because the mortality rate may be low. So how will you operate your critical or non-critical business if that kind of effect hits? So for pandemic planning, the federal government and most experts recommend the plan, prepare, response model. There's a 4-step model for some other types of things, but pandemic, you really only need these 3. First, the plan development is the board of directors and senior management's responsibility. The board oversees the development of the plan. Senior management actually has to do the work. So they'll develop the plan, communicate it, test it, make sure it's updated. So as we do this, we basically want to do a business impact analysis, right? As part of your normal business continuity management. So what are some of the areas to look at? Well, you want to assess and prioritize your essential business functions and processes that may be affected by a pandemic, right? You're probably already checking to see if they're affected by hurricanes or earthquakes or tornadoes or whatever the prevailing natural disasters are in your area. One of the things I like to say about business impact analysis and continuity planning is you take the same information, but depending on what the problem is you're trying to solve, you're looking at it in a different way, right? So you're going to have to slice it up again, this time for pandemics, right? We want to identify the potential impact of a pandemic on the institution's essential business functions and processes, as well as the supporting resources. This is the thing that's typically not in flux in most other types of disasters, right? The personnel usually isn't, right? Either you can remove them from the area or they're only out of commission for the duration of the hurricane, for example, or it is unlikely for half or all of them to be affected by the tornado or earthquake or whatever. You want to identify the potential impact of a pandemic on your customers, right? Who's going to be the most affected? What could have the greatest impact on the local economy or the world economy, right? How you think about your business may come into play here, but realize how you think of your business and how others think of your business may be different, right? And you also want to identify the legal and regulatory requirements for your business functions and processes. Some organizations, like banks, are required to notify their regulator when they experience certain types of business continuity events. Do you have similar requirements? Many critical infrastructure sectors have them. Is that included in the activation of your plan? Do you actually have a checkbox for, contact whomever? Do you have legal requirements, for example, that say you must not close down for longer than X number of days, or that you must process transaction within a certain time frame, like banks do, right? Do your plans include compliance with those external requirements? It's not enough to get up and running. You may have to get back up and running faster than you want to. If so, you need to estimate the maximum downtime that you're going to have associated with your processes that might occur during a pandemic, right? You want to cross-train for your key business processes. Do you have a backup person who can do your critical jobs? You do? Great. Do you have a second? How about a third? Are all of their procedures written down in case that the first, second, third, and fourth people aren't available? These are the kinds of things you need to think about for a pandemic. And you also want to evaluate the plans of the service providers that you are going to rely upon if you want to operate during a pandemic, right? You want to make sure that if you have a lease, that the lease doesn't say they can kick you out. You want to make sure you have sufficient internet capacity if you're going to move everyone to telework. That used to be my big gotcha, but obviously now that's not so much, right? But if that is how you're going to handle it, you need to have it, right? You need to make sure it'll work. So that's the planning. Now let's get to the preparation phase, right? So planning is we're writing it down. Preparation is we're actually going to do some action, right? So first, you want to document your processes and procedures and keep them updated. Why? Because like I said, your first string, your second string, and your third string might not be available. And fourth string might be what you have to work with, right? And you can't necessarily have that old-fashioned hand-holding while they're doing it, right? You want to coordinate with your outside parties. You want to make sure that, for example, if you're counting on your telecom provider to be able to turn the speed up for telework, that they know that, right? That they might require that to be in contract, or else they may have the right to say no. They may require you to pay some type of retainer, smaller than having the full service all the time, but some small retainer so that they can assign the capacity to you quicker, right? And you also want to make sure that you can identify triggering events, right? The WHO called for a pandemic in your region, has the CDC for Louisiana, the Louisiana Department of Health, right? But also, you want to prepare for things like on-site incidents, employee incidents from a known pandemic, which we'll get into in a second. We also want to prepare some mitigating controls if we can, right? So automation in general, the fewer humans you need to do a thing, the fewer human touches that thing is necessary, you need to do that thing, the better it's going to operate when there are fewer humans to oversee it, right? Simplifying processes in general. Again, I'm just talking about doing this ahead of time, right? This is a good reason to go, maybe we don't need 3 reviews. Maybe 2 is good. Maybe 1 is good. Maybe 1 plus an automated review is good enough for this process, right? Cross-train and train deep, right? Rotate your people during normal operations. Make sure your third string person gets experience doing the thing that they're the third string for, right? And then test, right? So I visited a bank one time. They randomly chose 20% of the employees from the employee list. And basically one morning, they tapped each one of those employees on the shoulder. The employee got to send 1 email, and then they left their desk. That's it. Those selected employees had to spend the day like cleaning out supply closets, other kind of overdue work, right? They weren't having a pizza party, but the rest of the bank had to try to work with what was instantaneously 20% fewer people. This is during a business day. This was not an artificial test, right? One irony was the auditor who set up the exercise. She normally would like remind the executives of their regulatory requirements. She had her name chosen, right? So she went from active participation to purely passive, right? She still had to take notes and assess the effectiveness of the test. But she couldn't interfere. She couldn't remind them, about their reporting requirements to the FDIC, for example, right? And succession planning. What is that sequence going to be if people go out, but not just for your business processes, but for your leadership, right? All of your senior leadership or named executive officers are gone. Do you have a plan for that, right? Some banks I've been in have had, they're very small community banks. They've got the minimum number of named executive officers. They have a CEO, they have a CFO. That's it. That's all they're required to have. Well, that's 2 people and the bank is done, right? From a leadership perspective. They don't need to be necessarily named executive officers, but you need to have some idea of who you're going to tap to guide the ship if the normal people are not available. And finally, for preparation, remote access. So I could probably change this from maybe to there will be high reliance on employee telecommuting, working from home, right? This can affect remote access capabilities. capacity, bandwidth, authentication mechanisms. You want to make sure that you're prepared for that. People who work on site typically may not have remote access authority. They may not have high-speed internet at home. Do they have laptops in your organization, even though they may work from an office, or are they all desktops? And then are you going to need to buy, 10, 100, 1,000 laptops really quickly, provision them all during the middle of a pandemic, and then hand them out to people, right? I also want to analyze your remote access capabilities, right? Make sure that you know what your employee technology needs are going to be, and also understand, a little bit more about kind of where you are, right? Certain parts of certain communities have better high-speed internet than others. Certain parts of certain communities have better cell phone access than others. Here in South Louisiana, it's very common for people to have to drive an hour to get to an interstate, to get to, a city with a population more than 50,000 people. If you're based elsewhere and you don't know that about here, you might make assumptions that you really can't make, right? So you want to make sure that all of the assumptions you have are really going to be applicable. So now we get to the response, right? What are we going to what are we going to do during the pandemic? Well, first thing you want to do, protect your employees. You want to reduce or restrict. You might want to reduce or restrict corporate travel. You might want to encourage or require telework, right? That requires telecom availability, and your VPN might not support it, right? So here's one of the problems with actually flipping those switches, right? You can do all the planning and preparation you can, but until you actually have the load, you may not realize that you're going to hit your quality of service barriers, which isn't even on the VPN. Or you may not realize exactly how many people that is that need VPN licenses now, right? There's one bank that had an ice storm incident a number of years ago, and they thought, oh yeah, we got our stuff. Everyone's got laptops. We've got VPN. We'll be fine. And what they didn't realize, and there was no one in the office to actually change it, was that all of their routers had quality of service such that the VPN was squeezed. Everyone was squeezed into a lot smaller piece of their internet pipe than they really needed to be, right? And they don't really find out those kinds of things until until it happens and everyone's all of a sudden on the VPN, right? So response for sick employees, right? First thing, most important thing, right? Follow local CDC, WHO disease-specific guidance, right? You want to provide disease and other guidance to employees who are not at home, right? The people who are still coming into your office, maybe. What should they do, right? Not all pandemics will look like this one. Like I mentioned before, not all will require stay-at-home orders, right? So what happens if someone comes down with symptoms on site? Do you know who is going to respond and how, right? Even if you call emergency services, and even if they can respond, what if you have Good Samaritan employees who attempt to help and wind up infecting themselves and others because they don't know, they don't have bloodborne pathogen, aerosol training, et cetera, right? So you need to understand people who spend 8 hours of their day on your site. What are you going to do if someone comes down with the disease while they're there, right? And the final response piece is going to be reduced operations, right? So we were talking earlier about generally, adding automation, right? But in this case, you might want to plan for or implement special automation, right? Again, like I mentioned before, skipping certain steps or offering fewer options are another way to kind of reduce the complexity, because when people are in situations like this, as we all can tell now, you don't always, have the wherewithal to, you're not always firing on all cylinders, basically, right? You're not always able to to handle it, to handle everything you could handle normally, right? So skipping a few steps, making things easier for your employees may be a very important thing to do. But fewer employees are also going to naturally mean less work volume, right? If they're out. Conversely, like I mentioned um, in business impact, you may have less demand for your services, right? Depending on whether you are critical infrastructure, depending on whether you are um, the kind of infrastructure that, again, may not be quite as important as you think it is. So you need to have those ideas, and you need to understand that you may be ready and raring to go at full speed, even because of all this great work you've done, but you might not have the demand, right? And you can never really tell until the exact particular situation has arisen. All right. So general resources on pandemic planning guidance. The FDIC is kind of the group of all the federal banking regulators. They get together, they issue guidance on business continuity management, which includes this. They've also issued pandemic guidance based on a 2005 George W. Bush national strategy letter. Obviously, the CDC has guidance and had guidance even before this. Of course, those have been updated. And then, of course, specific COVID-19 issues. That's about it. So do we have any questions? Anyone who has anything they want to ask?
Thank you so much, Cliff. Please do submit your questions. I saw a bunch of folks have dialed in while we were mid-session. There's a Q&A box below. We'd love to hear from you. And I would love, while we're waiting for some questions to roll through, Cliff, are there any other examples you can give folks on how they may prepare for potential disaster? Like, what's a good test they could do to make sure that folks are trained? You mentioned that awesome example of the bank that randomly tapped the 20 folks and said, okay, you're out to go clean the store closet and we'll see if our business can function without you. What are some other practical tests for folks?
Yeah, so that's kind of the gold standard, right? You kind of want to make sure your stuff is pretty well in line before you do that kind of a thing. But just tabletop exercises are a good way to start out with, right? Imagine there's X% fewer people, right? What are we willing to give on? What are we willing to accept as far as less output, less business function, right? What are we willing to accept as far as less income, right? Where are our tolerances, right? You speak to many executives, and the first question you start asking them about risk tolerance, and they say, "Oh, no, I don't want any risk, no risk whatsoever." And then you start asking them, and you find out they do have a risk tolerance, right? Is it okay if you lost $1 million an hour? They say no. Is it okay if you lost $1 a year? They say yes. Now we just need to figure out where in between those two your actual risk tolerance is, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes that's useful to start the conversation. So I see there's a question here from Stephen Barnes. So yes. So in the beginning, I tried to kind of address that. So this should be generally part of business continuity management, is the more generic term that's used nowadays. Used to be business continuity planning, also known as disaster recovery planning, et cetera, et cetera. You could take your business impact analysis, right, which is supposed to identify all of your key critical processes and individuals and things like that, and you're going to slice it up in different ways for different things, right? The types of things that are acceptable to be skipped during a hurricane may be different than what's acceptable to be skipped for a pandemic. And this is just another column in the spreadsheet, if you will, if that's how you're tracking it, or another scenario, another chapter in your book that you kind of want to do, and take the same input information, the business impact analysis, and see how it looks from that perspective, right? Where depending on your industry, right? If you make widgets, well, do you make widgets for healthcare industry? Do you make widgets for any of the rest of those critical infrastructure agents or organizations? If not, you might accept not making widgets for a little while, right? You might accept the fact that no one's going to buy your widgets for a little while, right?
And for those who can't see the Q&A, I think Cliff, they may not be able to see the questions. The question Cliff is
Oh, I'm
answering
sorry.
right now, oh, totally cool, is would you consider this part of general disaster recovery plan, with this being focused in the pandemic scenario?
Yeah, sorry, forgot about that.
All good.
So Matthew has asked, is there somewhere business could find a list of best practices on this topic? So my background is in banks and banking. So I have most of the resources, for example, that I provided have been banking specific, simply because banks are generally considered a critical infrastructure organization, and they tend to know it, right? Everyone knows that if you can't get your money, people are going to be upset. But that doesn't mean that everyone is going to have those kinds of requirements, either legal or regulatory, like a bank does, or the societal psychological requirements. But if you want, right, banking tends to go through this a little bit, almost as probably better than most other industries. So I recommend FFIC.gov. They have pandemic guidance. They have business continuity management booklet, things like that. Those are what I tended to focus on. Although the CDC has guidance for how to do business continuity and business response.
Looks like we just got another one in. So the American economy is driven by a consumer market, meaning everyone goes out shopping in stores, malls, eats out, goes on road trips, works for construction, outdoor projects as well. Most of such people are on a daily basis and spend on a daily basis, and that's this blood supply to the economy. How can this be made to start flowing at the earliest rather than shutting down completely? Can current administration be explained and convinced easily to start the economy flowing without having to wait until a pandemic is over?
So my talk is focused on business level, right? Not at the governmental level. In general, that kind of issue has been dealt with or is addressed by agencies like CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, DHS, groups like that. But unfortunately, right, this is the trade-off, right? It's in this case, at least with this particular pandemic, with this particular disease, there are trade-offs between, mortality rate and the way the economy, basically. So, alrighty. So another question: what risk assessments should be taken while scaling back up again? Very good question. So in general, recovering from a pandemic is going to tend to look a lot like recovering from any other wide area disaster like a Katrina or something like that. However, again, you cannot plan for absolutely everything. One of the best things you can do is realize, hey, things are going to get back to normal, and start planning for that once you know the type of disease you have, the type of pandemic you have, right? I know that a lot of the Chinese manufacturers have gotten back into the swing of things, but they're having problems because other Chinese manufacturers haven't started back up, et cetera, right? Countries put in, and entire industries are putting the brakes on things, and the restart is going to be a little bumpy, right? And how that happens is going to be something that's going to be very specific to your organization. Another question: online tools businesses should consider using and training their staff to prepare on disasters. In general, right? How do I put it? So there's different levels, right? Whenever you're talking about training for disaster, you have the individuals who need to plan for it, right? And the individuals who need to respond to it in general. General disaster planning is going, training is going to help the people who need to plan for it, right? But it's difficult to create generic training for how to respond to it that's been created outside of your organization, right? Part of the problem is, again, we have so many different types of companies, so many different industries. How does someone, it's difficult to create a training online that explains how your particular organization in your particular locality in your particular economy in your particular city, state, etc., should respond, right? And as I've seen in many bank trainings that have tried to do something similar, those trainings oftentimes get things wrong, and then the bank needs to go, oh, wait a minute, no, ignore slide 3, right? Let's replace it. So really the best thing to do is try to make something yourself. Anything that is focused on your specific company, even if it may not be as slick or as easy to use as some of these online tools, maybe is probably going to be a lot more valuable to your employees. So, and then another question, this is a black swan event or maybe a simulation of sorts, but in your opinion, the critical tools needed by individuals to productively be engaged and work through an event as such, right? The critical tools are going to be, again, dependent upon your particular company, your particular industry, right? What their role is in your company. There are some parts of my company that literally have not hiccuped, right? I work from home before this. I work from home now. I'll work from home after this. Other people who go into an office now, they're working from home, and they're in the group chat like, hey, I missed the whole thing where I run into someone in the hall and whatever. Most of most of what people find they miss are the kinds of things, serendipity, that you really have to plan for if you work remotely. However, general remote work tools are going to be useful for information, for knowledge workers. But again, if you make widgets, right, you may not be able to engage your people, or depending on how you make widgets, you may be able to ship them a box of raw material and they can make step 1 and they ship it to someone else, right? It all depends very much on what your scenario is, what you need to, if you have regulatory or other requirements, and specifically what you're doing. And it's difficult to answer that in general.
And maybe a plug for one of our talks tomorrow night. Speaker Gant Laborde is going to be focusing on how to lead a global remote workforce. So he may have some good tips on keeping your remote folks engaged in this unique time. We have time for, I believe, 2 more questions. If anybody else has another question for Cliff, give him a second to come through. Well, thank you, Cliff, so much for presenting. It's been enlightening as always, and we're really grateful for your time.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it.
Thanks.